Sarah Mitchell walked the long, sterile halls of the military base with an almost ghost-like presence. The echo of her mop swishing across the floors was the only sound that broke the silence as she moved from room to room, cleaning, polishing, and organizing. There was nothing remarkable about her, just another janitor in a sea of uniforms. Yet, the moment she entered a room, it felt as though the world took on a different rhythm. No one ever seemed to notice her, nor did she seem to mind. She went about her work with a quiet precision, her movements deliberate but devoid of any hurry, as if her presence was as fleeting and inconsequential as the dust she swept away. Every day, she followed the same routine. She entered through the back service entrance, a route known only to the maintenance staff and, perhaps, a few senior officers who barely acknowledged her. Her meals were taken alone in a cramped, windowless closet, her sandwich and black coffee consumed in quiet solitude. She didn't engage with anyone. No small talk, no friendly banter. She wasn't unfriendly, just invisible. To her, this was the way she preferred it. After all, it wasn't as if she belonged here, and that was just fine with her. Yet, even in this anonymity, there was something about Sarah Mitchell that stood out, something unspoken, something that lingered in the air. Her movements were precise, too precise for someone who only mopped floors. Her hands, though stained with cleaning products, held an elegance that suggested a history not yet revealed. Sometimes, when her eyes wandered across the soldiers in training, she would catch herself watching the drills with a certain familiarity. It was a look that didn't belong to a janitor. It was a look that belonged to someone who had once been in their shoes, someone who had been through the fire. But Sarah Mitchell was not someone who drew attention to herself. She wasn't the type to boast about what she knew or how she knew it. In fact, she seemed to avoid even the smallest of acknowledgments, slipping into the shadows the moment anyone seemed to recognize her. There was a quiet sorrow in the way she walked, as though she had long since buried the past under layers of time and routine. The military base, with its bustling soldiers and officers, seemed a world apart from the one Sarah inhabited. She existed within its walls, yet she remained, for all intents and purposes, a part of its unseen infrastructure, like the very floors she polished. Despite her quiet isolation, there were moments when the soldiers around her seemed to pause and take notice. A brief exchange of glances, a fleeting moment of acknowledgement, nothing that would draw attention, but enough to suggest that Sarah Mitchell was not as invisible as she wished to be. Perhaps it was the way her sharp eyes would linger on the military drills, her body still, her hands steady as she mopped. Or maybe it was the way the soldiers would unconsciously fall in line when they passed her in the hallways, giving her a bit more space, stepping aside for a brief second before moving on. Her presence, though subtle, was felt, yet no one dared to question it. Who would question a janitor? After all, the woman who simply cleaned the floors, who quietly swept away the remnants of the day. But beneath that quiet exterior, there was a history, one that, if uncovered, would reveal much more than the job title that had been assigned to her. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a janitor. No. There was far more to her than met the eye. But for now, that story remained locked away, hidden in the silent corners of the base. Sarah Mitchell moved through the hallways with the quiet efficiency that had become her trademark. The smell of freshly mopped floors lingered in the air, mixing with the faint sounds of training drills from the nearby room. She wasn't supposed to be part of the training, yet her eyes instinctively followed the young recruit who was struggling with the components of his rifle. His hands fumbled, frustration visible in the tension of his shoulders. She stood there, mop in hand. Her eyes narrowed as she observed the scene from the edge of the room. The recruit's hands shook as he tried to fit the pieces together, his fingers clumsy with the unfamiliar task. Sarah didn't move at first, but her gaze remained fixed on his struggle. She took a small step forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Without saying a word, she adjusted her grip on the mop handle, subtly demonstrating the proper position to hold it. It was a movement so fluid, so natural, that anyone who watched closely might have noticed the precision in the way she held herself. The recruit, glancing up through the window, caught the slight shift in her posture. Without thinking, he mirrored her, his hands following her lead as the rifle came apart with smooth precision. For a brief moment, Sarah watched him, her eyes still as calculating as ever. She saw the relief flood his face as he successfully completed the task. The squad leader, unaware of the silent help Sarah had provided, clapped the recruit on the back, offering his approval. But Sarah didn't bask in the quiet acknowledgement. She simply turned away, her focus already back on the task at hand. No one noticed the quiet exchange, no one except Sarah and the recruit, who would never realize the depth of her experience. As she returned to her cleaning, the moment passed like so many others, unseen and unremarked upon. But it was a small victory for Sarah, a reminder of the life she had once lived, a life where every movement had purpose and every action mattered. To anyone else, she was just the janitor. But to Sarah, these brief glimpses of the past were enough to keep her grounded in the present. She wasn't just cleaning floors. She was watching, observing, silently guiding the next generation of soldiers without them even knowing it. Her routine continued, unbroken, as the sounds of military life rang out around her. She could have been anyone, but she was no longer Sarah Mitchell. She was someone else, someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and chosen to remain hidden in the shadows, where no one could see her scars. Her skills, her true identity remained concealed beneath the mundane tasks of daily life. Yet, even in her silence, she was still a soldier, and she would always carry that part of her with her, no matter how hard she tried to bury it. The sirens wailed through the air, their shrill urgency cutting through the otherwise calm morning at the military base. Soldiers scrambled, gathering medical supplies and preparing the transport for the injured private who had fallen from the rappelling tower. But in the midst of the chaos, Sarah Mitchell stood still, as if frozen in time, watching the scene unfold before her. She was no longer the janitor, no longer the woman who cleaned the floors. She was someone else, someone who had the knowledge and instinct to act, to help, and to save a life. Captain Derek Morrison's eyes locked onto her as he moved toward the transport. His expression hardened as soon as he saw her, and for a brief moment, he stopped. The weight of the past seemed to crush him in that instant. He took a step forward, his body stiff with a mix of guilt and anger. His gaze flickered over Sarah, but he didn't look at her. He looked through her, as though she were a ghost, a reminder of something he couldn't escape. "Stay back," Morrison barked, his voice strained and commanding. His posture was rigid, as though the words had been forced out of him. He stepped into her path, his chest puffed out, his body language an unspoken barrier between them. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't move an inch, even as his command rang through the air. His eyes, filled with the heavy weight of past memories, met hers for the briefest moment before he quickly looked away. Sarah's hands, still gripping the mop handle, tightened ever so slightly. Her fingers flexed, but her expression remained neutral. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice. She stood there, silent, her calmness a stark contrast to the storm brewing within Morrison. He was fighting a battle she couldn't see, one that had nothing to do with the present, but everything to do with the past. Morrison's jaw tightened as he swallowed hard, trying to control the emotions that had been bubbling to the surface ever since he saw her. She was here, alive, standing right in front of him when he had been told, long ago, that she was dead. The memories came rushing back in flashes: chaos, blood, shrapnel, and the sound of an explosion that should have taken him with it. She had thrown herself between him and the blast, her body shielding him from death. He owed her his life, and here she was, standing as if nothing had ever happened. "You shouldn't be here," Morrison muttered, more to himself than to Sarah, his voice cracking under the weight of his own guilt. He reached for his radio, his hands trembling slightly as he keyed the mic to call for backup, but his mind was elsewhere, back in Fallujah, in the chaos of the battlefield. He could still hear her voice in his ear, urging him to stay awake as she dragged him through fire. He could still feel the blood on her hands, the quiet promise that he would survive, even as the world around them burned. Sarah didn't move. She didn't say a word, but the air between them thickened, charged with the unspoken history that hung like a shadow between them. Her eyes, though soft, betrayed nothing. The woman standing before him wasn't just a janitor. She was the same woman who had carried him through hell. She was the one who had sacrificed everything for a group of soldiers she had never met. And yet, she was here now, in this moment, ignored and unseen by those who had no idea who she truly was. Morrison's hand shook as he reached out to stop her. "This is military personnel only," he stated, his voice betraying the fragility of his control. He knew, as soon as the words left his mouth, that they were hollow. There was no denying who Sarah Mitchell was, but the truth was too much for him to bear. His entire existence since that day in Fallujah had been built on the lie that she had died with the others. Seeing her alive, seeing her here, shattered everything he had tried to rebuild. Her gaze never wavered, and with a slow, deliberate motion, she took a step closer, brushing past him as if he were just another obstacle in her path. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need his approval. The private needed help, and that was enough. The faintest flicker of something passed across her face, a mixture of pain and purpose before she turned away from him without another word. Morrison stood frozen in place, unable to move, his mind reeling. He had been a soldier once, a soldier who had fought beside Sarah and owed her everything. And now, here she was, the woman he had tried to forget, standing right in front of him. The truth crashed over him like a wave, pulling him under. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of the past pressing down on him, suffocating him. As Sarah moved toward the medical team, her back straight and her posture unyielding, Morrison took a step back. His breath was shallow, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't stop her. She didn't need his permission. She never had. She had done far more than anyone could ever ask of her. And yet, here she was, still putting others first, still willing to risk herself for the sake of others. The soldiers around him watched in silence, unsure of what had just happened, but sensing that they had just witnessed something far greater than a simple confrontation. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, no one moved. Sarah's figure disappeared into the crowd, her quiet authority leaving a lingering presence behind her. The rest of the military personnel returned to their tasks, but something had shifted, something they couldn't quite understand. Morrison stood still, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his survival, the weight of what he had lost and what he had gained. And standing there, in the wake of the confrontation, he realized that Sarah Mitchell, the janitor, was not the one who needed saving. It was him. The tension in the air thickened as General James Crawford entered the scene, his presence commanding immediate attention. He surveyed the gathering of soldiers and medical personnel, his gaze passing over the injured private on the stretcher and the hurried preparations for evacuation. Then his eyes fell on Sarah. For a moment, there was nothing extraordinary in the way he looked at her. But then, as he observed the subtle way she held herself, something shifted in his expression. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw clenched ever so slightly, as though he were seeing something he hadn't expected, a ghost from his past. Sarah, sensing the change, tried to pull away from the crowd. She lowered her head, instinctively retreating from the recognition she felt brewing. She was just the janitor. After all, just another civilian working in the background, unnoticed by most. But there was something about the way Crawford stood there, rooted to the spot, that made her feel exposed. She knew he knew. It didn't take much for her to sense it in the air between them. Master Sergeant Crawford's voice cracked as he uttered the words. His gaze softened, and then his eyes widened with recognition, the truth dawning on him in a slow, devastating realization. Sarah didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the name he had spoken. She didn't have to. She knew exactly what he was seeing, what he was remembering, and it tore through her. The flashbacks hit her in a rush, like a torrent of memories that she had spent years trying to bury. The blistering heat of Fallujah, the acrid smoke of burning vehicles, the screams of men dying on the battlefield. She could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire in her ears, feel the weight of her pack digging into her shoulders, and the constant tension of survival that never let up. She was back there, back in the chaos of war, holding the lives of her fellow soldiers in her hands. Every decision a matter of life or death. One memory stood out among all the others, clear as day. Morrison, barely 19, his eyes wide with terror, the sound of rockets firing overhead. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as he clung to her, his voice begging for his mother. Sarah had no time for fear. She was already thinking ahead, calculating their next move as she threw herself between him and the blast, taking the brunt of the explosion herself. She could still remember the heat of the shrapnel burning through her flesh, but she kept moving, pulling him through the wreckage, never letting go. But now, standing before General Crawford in the sterile light of the military base, Sarah felt a heavy weight settle on her chest. The years had passed, but the burden of those moments, those lives saved and lost, never truly left her. She had buried it all, discarded the memories, like broken pieces of a life that didn't belong to her anymore. And now, here was Crawford, the man who had once relied on her to keep him alive, looking at her with disbelief, with awe, and with something darker guilt. The general stepped closer, his hand reaching instinctively to his chest where the dog tags he wore rested against his uniform. "Rebecca," he whispered, the name like a prayer. "I thought you—" He stopped, his voice choking on the words, unable to finish the sentence. The weight of that loss, the loss of her in Fallujah, was something he had never fully processed. He had mourned her death, held memorials in her name, and yet here she was, standing before him as though the past had never happened. Sarah's eyes closed briefly, a fleeting moment of vulnerability passing through her as she tried to steady herself. She had always known this day would come, the day when someone would recognize her, when someone from her past would see her for who she truly was. But she had never been ready for it. She had never been ready to face the ghosts of her past. The men who had died because she had failed to save them. And the men she had dragged to safety at the cost of her own body. Crawford's face turned pale, the blood draining from his cheeks as the memories of that day in Fallujah came crashing back. He had been part of a unit that Sarah had saved, a group of soldiers who had all assumed they were going to die. He had witnessed her sacrifice firsthand, seen the way she refused to leave anyone behind. Even when the odds were stacked against her, he could still remember the sound of her voice, calm and steady, as she ordered him to keep moving, even as the world around them fell apart. And then, when it was all over, when the dust settled, she had been gone. They had all thought she was dead. "I don't understand," Crawford murmured, his hand trembling as he reached for his pocket. He pulled out a worn photograph, a memory from the past, and held it out to Sarah. It was a photo of the team, taken just before the mission that would change everything. Morrison's face was young, full of fear, but Sarah was there too, standing tall, her hand on his shoulder, a look of quiet strength in her eyes. She had been the pillar holding them all up, the one who had kept them alive when nothing else seemed to matter. "Rebecca," Crawford whispered again, his voice breaking as the memory of that day resurfaced in full force. "You saved us. You saved us all." The weight of the words hung in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of the debt that could never be repaid. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her actions had spoken louder than anything she could say now. She had given everything for them. And in return, she had been buried by the world, forgotten and replaced. The room fell silent as the pieces clicked into place, the realization spreading through the gathered soldiers like wildfire. Crawford stood there, staring at the woman in front of him, unable to comprehend the impossibility of it all. He had known her as a hero, but now he was seeing her as something far more complex, a woman who had survived a war that no one else could understand. For Sarah, the weight of the recognition was unbearable. She had spent years living in the shadows, hiding from the world, from the people who had once depended on her. She had buried Rebecca Reeves deep inside, letting Sarah Mitchell take her place in the world. But now, standing before General Crawford, it all came flooding back: the sacrifice, the pain, and the truth she had carried in silence for so long. She turned away, her heart heavy with the memories, but her eyes still focused on the task at hand. She wasn't Rebecca anymore. She wasn't a hero. She was just Sarah Mitchell, the janitor who cleaned floors. The past didn't matter now. The victory, the lives she had saved, they were all behind her, a different life altogether. And she was determined to leave it there. Sarah stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, her eyes fixed on the ground as the memories of Fallujah came crashing back. The sounds of the base, the footsteps of soldiers, the hum of overhead lights all seemed distant, as if she were no longer fully present in the world around her. Her mind was elsewhere, lost in the past. The weight of that day, the day that had forever changed her, pressed heavily on her chest. She could still hear the deafening roar of gunfire, the explosions that had sent men flying through the air. She could still see the faces of those she had failed, the faces of the soldiers who didn't make it out. And then there was Morrison, young and scared, his hands shaking as she pulled him to safety, taking the blast meant for him. She had promised him he would survive, even as she knew the cost would be high. She had been willing to sacrifice everything: her body, her life, for the sake of saving those around her. And in the end, she had saved some, but not all. The ones who didn't make it, the ones whose blood mixed with the sand, those were the faces that haunted her at night. The faces that she could never erase from her memory. They were the ones she couldn't save. And they were the ones who kept her awake in the quiet hours of the morning. Survival. Sarah had come to learn. was a heavy burden. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't something to celebrate. It was a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she had left behind. The others had their medals, their accolades, their praise. They had their moments of heroism etched in stone and ink. But Sarah didn't have that. She didn't want that. She didn't need to be remembered as a hero, because the truth was, she wasn't. The ones who had died were the real heroes. They had given everything, and she had lived. And every day since then, she had carried that guilt, that heavy weight of knowing that she was alive when so many others weren't. The truth was, Sarah didn't want recognition. She didn't want to confront the reality of her past. Being called a hero, being acknowledged for the sacrifices she had made, felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal to the men who had died, the ones whose names would never be spoken again, whose families would never know the full story. She had chosen to live anonymously, to fade into the background where no one could see her scars, both physical and emotional. She had buried Rebecca Reeves, the soldier who had fought and bled for others, and had let Sarah Mitchell, the janitor, take her place. But as the memories came flooding back, as the faces of the fallen haunted her thoughts, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice. Had she really escaped? Had she truly left the past behind? Or had she simply hidden from it? The truth was, she didn't know. The past had a way of catching up with you, of dragging you back when you least expected it. And now, with General Crawford's recognition, with the sudden resurfacing of her identity, Sarah was forced to confront everything she had tried so hard to forget. Her fingers tightened around the mop handle, the familiar grip grounding her in the present. She had done her best to keep moving forward, to find peace in the simple act of cleaning floors, of ensuring that others could train and live without knowing the burden she carried. She had found solace in the quiet, in the anonymity that came with being just another worker. But now, standing in the shadow of her past, she felt the weight of those old wounds, the ones she had thought long healed. She had never expected anyone to remember her, to seek her out. The recognition was both a gift and a curse. It was a reminder that her past, no matter how hard she tried to bury it, would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. And as much as she wanted to continue hiding, to remain Sarah Mitchell and not Rebecca Reeves, she knew that she couldn't keep running forever. The past had a way of demanding to be acknowledged, no matter how much you tried to ignore it. Sarah's footsteps echoed through the hall as she continued her work, each step heavy with the weight of the truth she had been avoiding. The janitor's uniform, the cleaning supplies, it all felt so insignificant compared to what she had experienced, what she had lived through. Yet, here she was, still moving forward, still performing the tasks that had become her new reality. She had chosen to leave behind the uniform of a soldier for the anonymity of a civilian. But the truth was, she would always carry the scars of war with her. She would always be Rebecca Reeves, even if no one ever knew it. The past could never be erased, no matter how hard she tried to bury it. And though she had found peace in the quiet work she did, there would always be a part of her that would never be at peace, a part of her that would always remember the ones she couldn't save, the ones who had died so she could live. And that was the reality she had to face, no matter how much she tried to hide from it. Captain Morrison stood in the dim hallway, his hands shaking as he clutched the worn photograph in his grip. His breath was shallow, his heart pounding with the weight of years spent hiding from the truth. Sarah stood across from him, her eyes not filled with anger, but with something deeper, something that made him feel even more unworthy of her presence. He had always been the one to give orders, to lead, to carry the weight of responsibility for others. But now, in this moment, he felt utterly lost, like a soldier without a cause. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough with the weight of the words that had been stuck in his throat for so long. I've been a coward. I didn't honor you. I didn't honor what you did for me. For all of us." The words seemed to choke him, as though saying them would somehow make everything real. His fingers gripped the photograph tighter, the edges curling as the memories rushed back the chaos of Fallujah, the explosion, the blood, and Sarah, always Sarah, holding him together when everything else was falling apart. He had survived because of her. And now, after all these years, he was face to face with the woman who had saved his life, the woman he had wronged. "I used to think I could forget you," he confessed. His eyes squeezed shut as if the act of speaking the truth would tear him apart. "That you were just a memory, something to bury. But I was wrong. You gave everything for us, and I took it for granted. I let the years pass, and I convinced myself that I was okay, that I didn't owe you anything. But the truth is, I owe you everything." Sarah stood still, her face unreadable. She didn't move, didn't react. Her gaze was steady, but her eyes held a depth of sorrow that Morrison couldn't begin to understand. The silence between them was thick, laden with years of unspoken words and feelings that neither of them had been ready to face. But now, in this quiet moment, they were forced to confront them. Morrison's knees felt weak, and before he realized it, he was on the floor, the weight of his guilt pulling him down. He had survived, and in doing so, he had dishonored the very woman who had saved him. He had lived a life of promotions, accolades, and empty praise. But none of it meant anything because it wasn't hers to share. He wasn't the hero. She was, and he had never told her that. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry for everything." Sarah's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. Her hand, weathered and strong from years of physical labor, reached out to gently touch the photograph he was still clutching in his hands. For a moment, she held it, her fingers brushing the worn edges. But it wasn't the photograph that mattered. It was what the photograph represented: the past, the lives saved, and the ones lost. "I never wanted to be a hero," Sarah said, her voice steady but laced with the pain of memories she had long buried. "I never wanted to be remembered. I just wanted to do my job. And keep everyone alive." She paused, her hands slipping from his as she stepped back, her eyes never leaving his face. "I never asked for your thanks, Captain. I just wanted to make sure you had a chance to live. I promised you, and I kept that promise, even when it meant losing a piece of myself." Morrison nodded, tears threatening to break through his carefully built facade. He had spent so long trying to justify his survival, trying to make sense of why he had lived when so many others hadn't. But in that moment, facing Sarah, the woman who had given everything for them, he realized the truth. It wasn't about surviving. It was about the responsibility that came with survival. It was about honoring those who had died, and it was about living with the weight of that responsibility every single day. "I didn't deserve it," Morrison choked out, the guilt in his voice impossible to hide. "I don't deserve to be here, to have the life I've had. You saved me, and I've spent the last 20 years pretending it didn't matter. But it matters. You matter." Sarah's eyes never wavered. She had heard the words he needed to say, but that didn't make the weight of his guilt any lighter. She had carried her own weight for years, silently serving, never asking for recognition. And now, as Morrison knelt before her, his heart broken by the truth he had denied for so long, she felt something stir inside her, a sense of peace, of closure. "You've done your part," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper in the stillness of the hallway. "You've survived. You have a family, a future. That's all I ever wanted for you. That's your honor now." She paused, looking down at him with a tenderness that surprised them both. "And now? It's time for you to live with that. It's time for you to forgive yourself." Morrison didn't know what to say. He had spent so long holding on to his guilt, believing that he could never atone for the life he had lived, while Sarah had carried the weight of their survival. But now, with her forgiveness, with her simple acknowledgement of his pain, something inside him began to shift. The weight of the past of the lives lost, the lives saved, began to feel more manageable, not because it was any less painful, but because he finally understood that he couldn't change what had happened. He could only honor it by living fully, by embracing the life she had fought so hard to give him. "I'll make it right," he vowed, his voice firm but broken. "I'll live in a way that honors you, that honors what you did for us." Sarah nodded, her expression softening as she stepped back, giving him the space he needed. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough. In that moment, they both understood something profound. Survival was not just about living. It was about living with purpose, with honor, and with the courage to face the past and forgive oneself. As Morrison stood, his body still trembling with the weight of the emotions he had kept buried for so long, Sarah turned away. She wasn't leaving him behind. She was simply letting him carry what he needed to carry. They both had their burdens. But in that moment, they shared something deeper than words could convey. "You lived," Sarah said, her voice quiet but resolute. "That's enough." And with that, she walked away, her steps steady as she continued on her quiet path, leaving Morrison behind, but not alone. The early morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the halls of the base. Sarah Mitchell moved through the familiar corridors, mop in hand, as she had done every day for the past 3 years. The base was still, save for the soft echo of her footsteps and the faint hum of military life unfolding in the distance. She had learned to embrace the quiet, the solitude that came with her work. The soldiers were busy with their drills, their routines, but she was just another figure in the background, her presence barely acknowledged. Her decision to remain anonymous had been difficult, but it had been hers. When General Crawford had offered her the chance to return to her military rank, to receive the recognition that had been long overdue, Sarah had refused without hesitation. She had no desire to relive the past or to reclaim the identity she had buried so long ago. The life of Rebecca Reeves, the soldier who had given everything for others, was gone, lost in the sands of time and the memories of war. What remained was Sarah Mitchell, the woman who cleaned floors, who kept the base running in the shadows, far from the spotlight. Sarah had found peace in this anonymity. It was a peace born not of avoidance, but of acceptance. She had accepted her past and the weight of the sacrifices she had made, but she had also accepted that her place was no longer on the battlefield. Her role now was different. It was quieter, simpler, and it allowed her to serve in a way that didn't require recognition. She knew that the soldiers who passed by her each day would never know the depth of her history. They would never understand the weight she carried. And that was just fine. They didn't need to. As she continued with her work, Sarah couldn't help but notice how the younger soldiers moved differently around her. There was a certain respect in the way they looked at her, a silent acknowledgement that seemed to come from nowhere and yet from everywhere. It was as if they sensed something about her, something that told them she was more than she appeared, but none of them ever spoke of it. They simply carried on with their training, just as Sarah carried on with her work. She wasn't looking for admiration, and she certainly wasn't looking for pity. She didn't need it. What mattered was that she could help in her own way, quietly guiding the next generation of soldiers without ever saying a word. There were days when the weight of the past threatened to break through, when the memories of Fallujah came rushing back in waves. On those days, Sarah would find herself pausing, her hand resting on the mop handle as she recalled the faces of the men she had saved and the ones she hadn't. The guilt would creep in, the ever-present reminder that she was living when so many others had died. But then, she would take a deep breath, let it pass, and return to her task. Her duty now was to ensure the base was clean, to maintain a safe space for those who would go on to fight battles of their own. That was enough for her. There was an undeniable strength in Sarah's quiet resolve. It was a strength that didn't come from grand gestures or loud proclamations, but from the simple act of showing up each day and doing what needed to be done. She had sacrificed her past for the sake of those who had survived, and in doing so, she had found a sense of inner peace that had eluded her for so long. She no longer needed to prove herself to anyone, not to the soldiers who passed by her, not to the generals who had forgotten her, and not even to herself. The days stretched on, one blending into the next, and Sarah found herself more and more content in her role. She had come to understand that the greatest victories were not always the ones celebrated with medals and honors. Sometimes, the greatest victories were the quiet moments, the moments when you chose to live in service to others, to make a difference in ways that no one could see. She had found meaning in the ordinary, in the act of caring for others without needing to be recognized. And so, she continued. Every morning, she would arrive before the sun had fully risen, her cleaning cart filled with supplies, and set to work in the quiet stillness of the base. She would clean the floors, dust the furniture, and make sure everything was in order, all the while knowing that her actions mattered. No one would ever know the full extent of her past, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the present, the work she was doing now, and the quiet sense of purpose that it gave her. In the evenings, after the work was done, she would often find herself sitting in the empty maintenance closet, a cup of black coffee in her hands, and reflect on the day. It was a simple life, but it was hers, and she had found a sense of peace in it that she never thought possible. The past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had chosen to live for the future, to serve in whatever way she could, and in doing so, she had found something even more valuable than recognition. She had found her own peace. Sarah Mitchell, the janitor, was no longer the woman who had fought in Fallujah. She was no longer the soldier who had given everything for others. She was something different now, something quieter, but no less significant. In the shadows, she continued to serve, quietly teaching the next generation of soldiers through her actions, her presence, and her quiet strength.